no basis for truth. I mean zero. Zero basis for truth. It is the most outlandish fairy tale I've ever heard in my life, and they have pushed it and pushed it and pushed it so that it's ingrained in our society and accepted in a way that I can't believe. And so I hope you got that. But the other two major things, the three things from this class, the first one being creation is the only option. The other two are, like I said, the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the covenants God made with Abraham, and I said two words over and over and over, and you're going to hear me keep saying them over and over and over, and that is that the covenants and promises made to Abraham were forever and everlasting. Because, and we'll see it some more today, it is in there so much, it's unbelievable. God makes himself extremely clear. They are forever and everlasting. And one of the reasons I think that's so important is because we have people of our own stripe, believe it or not, that think that those promises have been kicked aside and given to the church, and that's absolutely ludicrous. The third thing that I hope you remember was last week's. Last week is what I call the other side of the promises to Abraham, and that is the fact we looked at Isaac. All the promises funnel through Isaac. God is extremely clear that the promises are forever and everlasting, and God is extremely clear that the promises funnel through Isaac. And why is that important? Because there are a billion Muslims out there screaming and crying over promises that they think belong to them that do not belong to them. Yes, they're children of Abraham, but they're children from the child of rebellion, not the child of promise. So we've looked at all of this. We've talked about a number of things. I put this picture up here. We talked about that dome. That's going away, hopefully sooner rather than later. And I can't get off on that again. That was a fun study, but we'll get moving on here. Another thing that's important to remember is why at times Israel hasn't had their land. And I'm going to give you just the summary that I gave you before. God's going to give them their land back during the millennium, but God was very, very angry. And I like to look at some of this big picture stuff, and I told you. I told you about the major prophets, and I'll tell you about those here in just a second. But I have these things. They're kind of funny. I'm a weirdo. You guys know that. I'm a weirdo with like knick-knacky type stuff. I like to golf. I've told you. I'm the guy that likes all the golf knick-knacks. I can go in one of those golf stores and get in real trouble with my wife real quick because it's like, I need this. She's like, you have 5 of them. This one's different. You hunters know what I'm talking about. Anyways, I know it's a little bit different, but I'm the same way with, I love anything that's kind of a study aid. And there's this thing that I got, and it was something that, it was cheap. It was online, and it's this Bible study aid, and I have used this thing endlessly. I keep it tucked in my notebook that I carry with my Bible, and what it does is it breaks down the different books of the Bible. So here's the first 5 books, and what's nice is when these ones get old, I just print out new ones and cut them and all that. Well, this one, it shows, the Pentateuch, and it shows the time that the Genesis was written and the time period that it covers and who the author was, and then it'll break it down into like 5, 6, 7 sections. And I like it because have you ever been reading, I don't know, Leviticus, First Chronicles? You've been in there somewhere and you're reading and you're going, all right, I know what I'm reading, but like, what's the big picture here? And I always talk about the puzzle box. We've all put puzzles together. You wouldn't put a puzzle together without the box because you want to know the big picture of what you're looking at. And that's what I like about these. These have this, I don't really remember where I got them, but I know they're downloaded on my laptop, so I could probably find out where they came from. But anyways, I said all that to say this. If I get through the Pentateuch and through the history books, there's a lot of history books, and you get through the poetry books, and then you get to the major prophets. And I told you that Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and Ezekiel are God telling Israel how mad he is at them. And it's funny because I was looking at these the other day, and one of the sections in Isaiah is the sins of the kingdoms. You've got Israel and Judah, okay, basically Israel. And it's funny because the sins of the kingdoms in Isaiah, where God is telling them how mad he is, are chapters 1 through 39. It's not a small section. God is angry. Then you get to Jeremiah, and you have naming of the gross sins of Judah and judgment against Judah. Those are chapters 1 through 28. And then you get into Lamentations. You've got Jeremiah mourning over the beautiful city, and you've got God's anger expressed. Then you get to Ezekiel, and you've got God expresses his anger for over 20 chapters. You've got four major prophets, not only major in size, like we've read Isaiah and Jeremiah, they're big books, but they're major in their importance when it comes to the prophecies. And so it's interesting. I mean, God was angry with them, and he, like I said, he took their land, then they got it back. Then you run, he says how angry he is in those four major prophets, and then you run into Daniel, and they're in Babylon. That's why you have the cool story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They wouldn't bend, they wouldn't bow, they wouldn't burn. That's a fun song if you've never heard it. But anyways, they will get their land back, but we've seen this history, and we've talked about it already, and we're going to move on, but God gets mad, he takes their land, and then they kind of get it back, and then they get it back, and then you've got them rejecting Jesus, and they lose it in 70 AD. They don't get it back till 1948, and they don't even get it all back, and they're still fighting for it today. And they're going to get it back, but then, like I said, during the tribulation, we know they're scattered. We see that in Hebrews and James. And they're going to get it back. They're going to come back and I mean, what a mess. I think it's a good example. It's a multi-millennial example to us as Christians. If we would just do what God wants us to do and stay with that, I think we wouldn't have you ever see someone whose life goes up and then it goes down and it goes up? I mean, that's kind of life in general, but have you ever seen somebody who really kind of has a time and they're saved and they know they should be doing right, but they're not? God has a way of taking us behind the woodshed, as they say. So anyways, I like to look at these big picture type things, and so I wanted to start this morning with one more of those. Before we get into some of these stories, we will look here. I'm going to do just kind of, I haven't really done one of these yet, and I want to show you something because I like knowing where we are. We did this with dispensations. A month or two ago, I showed you a dispensational chart that shows you where we are dispensationally. Let's look at where we are in Genesis. Obviously, we covered creation in Genesis 1 and 2. If you ever see an outline of Genesis, by the way, they're kind of funny. They range wildly. This one on here has like 5 sections. Normally they have like 7 sections. The one I'm going to show you has like 11, but you understand we could subdivide this ad nauseum like an English teacher. But anyways, we talked about creation. I just told you the importance of creation and evolution. We looked at it for like 3 weeks. The fall. The fall and the study of the fall is and was so important. We went over some of that because those first 3 chapters of the Bible explain everything how it is today. That's what's so beautiful about the book of Genesis. If you understand the book of Genesis, not only do you have creation understanding, you have the fall understanding. You understand, I've had multiple conversations with people this morning about our health. There are some of us who mine's not a serious one, but some of us are on certain medications or whatever, and we're trying to figure things out. And we are going to be doing that till the day we die or hear a real loud trumpet. We all have these problems because it's part of the fall. We have to work tomorrow. I was telling my wife, I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I said, I might have to go into the office this afternoon for a little while because I understand what is coming at me this week for work. I don't like to work on Sundays, but sometimes it's required. But work is there, and work is the way it is because of the fall. And then when you get all the way to Abraham, you study. Well, then you can understand the Middle East. You can understand everything that's going on in the world today if you really understand the book of Genesis. That's why it's so important. And that's why I say, I know this sounds so weird to say out loud, but I'm going to say it again. If the book of Genesis isn't right, I'm going to throw the whole Bible out because that book right there has the foundations for absolutely everything. But it is true. Cain and Abel. Okay, Cain and Abel is in Genesis 4. I won't get into that, but then you've got a genealogy. Now, usually if you read charts or look at charts, like I said, of the breakdown of Genesis, they're not going to highlight a genealogy in chapter 5. They're going to just lump it in with Noah. But what's interesting about this genealogy in chapter 5, it's super important because it goes from Adam to Noah and his 3 sons. It goes from Adam to Noah and his 3 sons, and we're going to run into another genealogy here in just a second. But when it gets to Noah, that's when we get to Noah and the flood there in chapters 6 through 9. And that explains a whole lot of what's going on in the world today. And we looked at some of those proofs when we actually talked about creation and evolution. The world's geography is how it is today because of what the flood did. It is unbelievable. Genesis has the answers to absolutely everything. You just have to read it and believe it. What's interesting, you get on the other side of Noah, you run into another genealogy. And what's funny is these are important because I don't know about you, I don't like to read there's nothing worse than reading whole books of names. my grandma, my dad's mom, before she passed, it wasn't long before she passed, but she pulls out these old photo albums, and we're going through them, and that whole side, my dad's mom's whole side is very, very German. There's Ostendorfs and Schmidts, okay, lots of German. But anyways, she's showing me pictures of her grandparents and her great-grandparents and all this stuff, and I'm looking at the dates, and I said, Grandma, this was during the Civil War. And she goes, yeah. And I said, why haven't you shown me this stuff before? It was so neat to see people that are in my genealogy that were there during the Civil War and where they lived, because they actually lived over in Illinois during the time of the Civil War. And of course, that's where Lincoln was from. And she had all these cool stories. And I'm sitting there going, why didn't you tell me all these stories before? But it was my genealogy, so I was at least somewhat interested in it. Have you ever heard somebody else talk about their genealogy? I go blank the second I know what they're talking about. I don't care. We kind of have that thing. Don't we? But anyways, it's like when I hear, I've said this before 1,000 times, I'm a waste of an Idahoan. The only thing worse than, I don't mind hunting. But the problem is when I hear somebody talk about hunting. Have you ever heard an Idahoan tell a hunting story? Kill me now. I'm sorry. But I've heard them all, and I just couldn't care about how long you were glassing the side of a hill or what the wind direction was. I don't care. I've heard so many of them. We've got this guy at work, and I absolutely love him, and once a year he pulls in with these antlers sticking out of the back of his work truck. And I'm like, why are they sticking out of the back of your work truck? Because I took the work truck. You're not supposed to take the work truck hunting. But anyways, but it's interesting because there are certain things we care about and don't care about, and I don't know about you, but there's parts of the Bible where we're going, oh, this is pretty dry, but it's important. It is so important. That genealogy in chapter 5 takes you from Adam to Noah. And what's interesting about that genealogy in chapter 10, it's actually a breakdown of 3 separate genealogies. You've got Japheth, then Ham, then Shem. And what's interesting, and I was going to talk about this later, but it's true. Japheth, his descendants kind of look like this, okay, no surprise, okay, European and all that. What's interesting, if you look at people, white Caucasian people if you look at the numbers of us across the world, it's pretty low. It is. There are some statistics that put it below 25% of the population. There are some that put it in the single digits. I know it feels like there's a lot of us because you live in Boise, Idaho. Okay, you walk around, it's like, there's one. Okay, you go to Salt Lake City or Phoenix, there are some places where there's a lot of us. But compared to the rest of the world, there's not. In fact, then you get to the genealogy of Ham. Ham and his descendants mainly went down to Africa. They're the darkest of the skin, I should say. And what's interesting is their population is similar to ours. The greatest population on this planet, hands down, came from Shem. It came from Shem, and it has to do with the promises, by the way, that God gave to Abraham. He said, kings are going to come out of you. He said, nations are going to come out of you. And even when he was talking about Ishmael, who came from Hagar, he goes, he's going to be a great nation. He didn't mean great as in like good. He meant great as in a lot. Okay, but what he's saying is all those came from Shem. There's a reason why over half of the world's population came from that one guy. Well, that's important too, and I'll tell you why. We'll look at some of this here in just a minute. I just want to remind you, when it comes to chapter 10 and chapter 11, you got the Tower of Babel. But you know what's funny about chapter 11? Chapter 11 is not funny if you're talking about taxes. But anyways, every time I say chapter 11, it sounds like somebody's filing for bankruptcy. But anyways, what's interesting about chapter 11 is we put the Tower of Babel because it's kind of like this mental marker. You know, when you're reading, you're like, oh, Tower of Babel's in chapter 11. And so after that, Abraham shows up. Okay, but you know what, really? Chapter 11 is not about just the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel's only in 9 verses. The first 9 verses. Do you know what the rest of the chapter is? Guess what? A genealogy, another one of Shem. And you're like, well, I thought we just saw Shem. Chapter 5 led to Shem. In chapter 10 ends with Shem. And then chapter 11, you got more Shem. You say, why? Because Shem's kind of the important one here. Okay, if you haven't caught on to that yet. And in chapter 11, that genealogy takes you from Shem all the way to a guy named Abram, or who we call Abraham. It's super important. I must remind you of 2 books. I'm always pushing books. Last week, Brother Gipp was in this class because Brother Walski was out. And so they came in here and he heard me talk a little bit about some of the Bible issue, some of the King James Bible issue. And Brother Gipp came up to me. Now, he and I worked on 8 videos together about the King James issue, but he knows that's something that's near and dear to my heart. But he came up to me out there afterwards and he goes, "Do you read?" And it's Sam Gipp. So I went, "Sometimes," because I thought he was joking, because Sam's always joking. He goes, "No, I'm serious." He goes, "Do you like to read?" I said, "Man, I read all the time." He says, "You've got to get this book," and he says, "It's in the bookstore," and I haven't read it yet because I just got it last Sunday, but it says, "Is the oldest manuscript a fake?" And it's about the Sinaiticus and how fake it is. And so anyways, that's one that's in the bookstore. I'm looking forward to reading that. But I'm always pushing books, and the one I push for chapter 10 and chapter 11, there's 2 of them. And then I'm going to give you an answer for people that don't like to read. The first one I've told you about before. It's called One Blood, and it's written by Ken Ham. The warning with that one, of course, he doesn't use strictly King James verses, but you can eat the meat and spit out the bones and all that, or however it goes. But anyways, One Blood, and that one's really interesting. But the other one is called The Tower of Babel by Bodie Hodge. And that one is so important because it's a little misleading that it's called The Tower of Babel. I've told you this about this book before. But the Tower of Babel, the book, doesn't just talk about the Tower of Babel. It's interesting about the Tower of Babel, but the main part of the book is telling you where the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth came from. And it's really interesting, not only who they became, but where they ended up settling. And my favorite part about those 2 books is for the people that don't like to read. Because both those books, you can find them on YouTube. Ken Ham has a lesson. If you were to look up Ken Ham, One Blood, on YouTube, you will run right into one of his lectures that he gives on the book he wrote. And if you were to look up Tower of Babel by Bodie Hodge on YouTube, you will find a lecture with all kinds of pretty pictures and all kinds of stuff. And it's fascinating to hear the men who wrote those books actually explain these things. And so for those of you who really like to deep dive into some of this stuff that we didn't have time to get into, those books will definitely lead you in the right direction. Obviously, in this outline here, I guess would be the best call, is you're going to have some overlap. You've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you're going to notice some overlap because, like Isaac is born in chapter 21. He's almost offered on the altar in chapter 22, and he doesn't die until chapter 35. But the reason I have 21 through 27 is because the main part of Isaac is 25, 26, and 27. I should not turn pages in different directions because then I get lost up here. So anyways, the last slide and this slide, like I said, are kind of big picture slides. And we've talked a decent amount already about Abraham and Isaac. But we're going to look here in Genesis chapter 17. Because what's interesting about the rest of Genesis, and we've already looked at some of them. Oh, let me put one more up here. Since we're looking at big picture stuff here. Genesis 37 through 50, I call it the 12 tribes. Obviously, every other outline is going to just put Joseph. That's why I put emphasis on Joseph. But the 12 tribes, you could argue, are as important as anything in the entire Bible. We've gone over this before. They are going to be the names of the 12 gates of heaven. You're not getting away from the 12 tribes. So anyways, I wanted to get that through. But when you come to the rest of the book of Genesis, what's interesting is there are a lot of half-chapter and full-chapter stories. A lot of them. And some of them might not seem important, but it's interesting what you can learn from them. And we're going to start with, we're going to be here in chapter 17 in just a second, but I want to kind of remind you the context, and I talked about this a little bit last week, how in Genesis chapter 15, Abraham is basically complaining. Let's just be honest. He's complaining to God that he doesn't have an heir. God has promised him all these things. Starting in Genesis 12, God promises Abraham all these things, and he doesn't have an heir. And so God shows up in chapter 15, and he says, you are going to have an heir, and you are going to have descendants as the stars in the sky. And chapter 15 says that Abraham believes him, and it's counted to him for righteousness. Well, you don't even get one chapter later, chapter 16, and Sarah comes to Abraham and says, we've been waiting and trying and all this. We're not having a baby. You need to have one with Hagar. And Abraham goes, okay. So causes eternal problems for everybody. So it's interesting, in 15, he believes God. By 16, he's already trying to take matters into his own hands. I think that should teach us a lesson. But then you get to chapter 17. Because in chapter 16, you've got Hagar giving birth, of course, to Ishmael. And then in 17, God has to make himself very clear. And we went over this a little, but this is going to build up to what we're going to be talking about this morning. In chapter 17, like let's say verse 7, he says, I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations for, and I told you, I've got this part underlined, an everlasting covenant. You go to verse 8, he says, I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an, there's that word again, everlasting possession. And I will be their God. You look at the end of verse, like let's say 13. He says that my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. So this is good. This is good. But he says it's not going to be with Ishmael. It's not going to be with Ishmael. And we looked at this last week a little bit. We're just building up to something here. Verse 19, God said, Sarah, thy wife, shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I've got all the rest of the verse underlined. And I will establish my covenant with him, with Isaac, for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. He's very clear. It's going to be, he's so clear that you look at verse 18 and it says, as for Ishmael, I have heard thee, behold, I have blessed him, and on and on and on. But, verse 21, my covenant will I establish with Isaac. And then we looked at some places in the New Testament where it says these things as well. So God clearly is going to bless, he's going to bless Isaac. Let's see here. I'm going to skip that for just a second. And then we will let's go over to chapter 18. So we're leading up, we got all that, and we get to chapter 18. We're going to read a lot here, but it's a Bible class. I think that's okay. Here's one of these stories. Here's one of these stories I was talking about. This is kind of, you can look at it as one full story in the whole chapter or two half stories here. But what's interesting about this one is we're going to see some things about Abraham that are really interesting, because I don't know about you, but I remember growing up and thinking, why did God bless Abraham? What was it about Abraham? And I would look in the Bible and couldn't find anything. It's like, it just feels like he just picked somebody and decided to bless them. And so, but I think there's hints. And I think some of those hints are in here. And plus this section is going to show us, a little bit of context about the family here. Let me make sure I don't get too over my head here. All right, let's start in chapter 18. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre. And I'm already going to pick on the other Bibles. I don't know why. It says something about, instead of the plains of Mamre, they say something about where the big trees are. It's like, it sounds like a redneck when you get directions. Hey, you go to the big tree. When you hear the swarming of the bees, you've gone too far. You know, that kind of thing. I don't know. But I've got some places in here that are very specific where I accidentally found out the other Bibles butcher it a little. But anyways, the Lord appears unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. All right, so we're going to obviously think about noon. I've got friends that live in Phoenix, and we were laughing in Phoenix because Phoenix gets hot around noon, and then it kind of gets a little cooler. And he's like, well, yeah, isn't it that way everywhere? I'm like, not in Idaho. It gets hotter until 5, and then 5 is kind of the heat of the day. But over here, I'm going to guess it's somewhere around noon. Verse 2, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. These 3 men are, I'm going to let you know now. One is the Lord. We know that from, let's just look at that. Verse 1 says the Lord. Verse 13, the Lord said. Verse 17, the Lord said. Verse 22, Abraham stands before the Lord. Verse 26, the Lord said. Okay, so on and on. One of them is obviously the Lord. The other 2 are angels, and we'll look at that in just a second. But they stood by him, verse 2, and when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground and said, my Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Maybe that's where the Bible's got the tree problem. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on. For therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, so do as thou hast said. And what's interesting is he said, I will fetch a morsel of bread, but he knows who to go to for the morsel of bread. In verse 6, Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah. Hun, we've got some visitors. That's what's going on here. And said, make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the earth. I love cake, but I don't think it's that kind of cake. Verse 7, and Abraham ran unto the herd and fetched a calf, tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. Okay, so he says, I'm going to give you water and wash your feet, but really what he's doing is he's going to get these folks a feast. He's going to get the Lord and these 2 angels, which is proof your glorified body can eat. Good news. Okay, but it gets even better, because verse 8, and he took butter I think that whole line should just be underlined. And he took butter. That's my life verse right there. And milk, and the calf which he had dressed. So he's got bread, he's got butter, he's got milk, and then now he's got meat. It doesn't get any better, which he had dressed and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. Isn't that interesting? So this is something was not only cultural to them at the time. There are still cultures that do this to this day, where if somebody was to come in, here we're so blockaded. We've got houses and streets and everything that are very distinct. But in other places, if somebody shows up, it is their culture to provide you with food and drink and sometimes shelter and protection. So that's what they do, is they feed him. Verse 9. And they said unto him, where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, behold, in the tent. As you can see, I'll put the picture up here. She was listening in the whole time. It's a typical woman. All right, anyways. He said, behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. She can't have kids anymore. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also? And the Lord said unto Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh? Well, now, I don't know if he heard it because she was so close, but I think he just heard it in her heart. Shall I of a surety bear of a child, which am old? Verse 14, is anything too hard for the Lord? What a wonderful line. I've got that line underlined. It reminds me of two songs. One is anything too hard for God? It's a great song. And there's one I saw, it's a line from, I think it was like a shirt. And it said, since when has impossible ever stopped you? And I love that line. Impossible is nothing for God. But we get kind of hard on Sarah here for laughing at God. But what's interesting, if you go, and we won't go there right now, but if you go to the previous chapter, chapter 17, verse 17, Abraham laughs so hard, he falls on his face when God tells him he's going to have a son with Sarah. So verse 14, at the time appointed I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. Reminds me of when God ran into Adam and Eve and starts questioning them. And he said, nay, but thou didst laugh. Kind of reminds me, unfortunately, of the people that laugh at God today, but will stand before him someday. And he's like, you got to imagine, he would say, you laughed at me. Oh, no, we didn't laugh. Roll the tape. He'll show them they laughed. But anyways, verse 16. And the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? And what's interesting, he's not even talking to Abraham here, but look what he says in verse 18. Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. God is so adamant about, it's funny, I'm staring at the Israel flag right now. God is so adamant about blessing Israel and his nation and the people that come from him, that even when he's not talking to Abraham, he's saying, hey, I'm going to make him a great nation. And like I said, I always had this thing where I wondered, why did God, have you ever looked at the blessings of God, and it feels like God chooses to bless certain people, and you go, why? Why would you bless them? You know, and it feels like some people don't get blessed, and you're like, why wouldn't you? When I heard, I'm not a crier. I don't know why I'm not a crier. I'm just not a crier. And I don't have a problem with people who cry. It's just people who cry over nothing. That kind of gets on my nerves. But anyways, I think I've only cried. I've worked at that office over there for 22 years. I think I've cried twice in that office. Once was when I got a phone call that said that Weldon Jones had been killed in a car crash. He was a missionary to Mexico. In fact, Brother Titus we went there and visited him in 2002. Not only was he an amazing missionary, he was also a family friend. When they would come into town, they would stay with our family. They would swim in my parents' pool and go hunting with my uncle. I mean, they were just very good family friends. And this man, I am telling you, was a servant of God. You should have heard some of the things this man did as a missionary. He worked his tail off, if you don't mind me saying. He worked and worked and worked, and it was amazing what he did. And the minute I heard he had lost his life, I thought, well, God, why would you do that? You had such an amazing servant. And I have theories on why God takes certain people early, and it's in the Bible there that it says of whom the world was not worthy. I think that could be one of the deals. But again, you look at the blessings of God sometimes, and unfortunately, when we look at the blessings of God, we're so human, we monetize everything. So we think the blessings of God only have to do with money. Well, that's not necessarily the case. But what was interesting with Abraham, he even blessed Abraham with money. You remember when we were looking in chapter 13, that when they left Egypt, they weren't supposed to be there, but when they were coming out of Egypt, and it doesn't say he was rich, it says he was very rich. Abraham was very, very rich. He had promises of land. He had promises of countless descendants. He had nations that were promised him. God promised kings would come from him. He'd be in the line of Christ. I mean, Abraham had everything, and I've always wondered why. And I don't think we'll ever have this fantastic, perfect definition of why God blessed Abraham. But I think the next verse has got an interesting tell. Look at verse 19, just the first 4 words. For I know him. And this is the part where I want to, I told you, I got like this weird little habit where I check what the other Bibles say on certain things. I didn't mean to, but I was Googling this one thing and I looked it up. And it was interesting because these other ones, the other versions, they don't say for I know him, they say for I have chosen him. Well, now he chose Abraham, don't get me wrong. But in this context, that makes it sound like you've got some kind of Calvinistic thing going on. In fact, there's a couple of places where they do stuff that does not make any sense to me. Because here it says, God says, I know him. What's he know about him? That he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of. God says, one of the reasons I'm going to bless him is because I know him. I know I can trust him. I know he's going to lead his house. Now, there's a load to talk about here, and it's a whole study, and I don't really want to do it because we could take really the rest of the time and do it. But sometimes chasing the blessings of God, that's not a bad thing. It's not bad to want God to bless you. But if we are looking for some secret formula for God's blessings, it's not there. And one of the reasons I can tell you it's not there is because, yes, he blessed Abraham, but also there's this great guy. I mean, really, God even uses the word perfect when he describes him, and it's the book of Job. Okay, so if you're looking for God's blessings to you and me don't always line up with what God counts as blessings. And so that's the problem. But I can tell you this. A bare minimum for earning God's blessings is right there, where he said, for I know him. Having a relationship, obviously being saved, and having a relationship with God, now that's a bare minimum. It reminds me of Romans 12:1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, and then that last part, which is your reasonable service. God says there are bare minimums in here, and I think one of the bare minimums for getting the blessings of God is to have a genuine relationship with him. Let me give you an example. Many of us in this room have kids. We've all been kids at one point. Isn't it a lot easier to bless your child when they're being good? I mean, it really, really is. You say, well, that's not the same. It's kind of the same with God. It really is. He is our Father. And when we are doing what he wants us to do, I think it's easier for him to bless us. Now, again, blessings don't always show up in the form of money. We're all looking for that magic check in the mail from some rich uncle we didn't know about. My rich uncle is down fishing with my parents. But anyways, I won't say who that is. Some of you know what I'm talking about. He ain't cutting me no checks. But anyways, but that's how we do it with God. We always look at and unfortunately, God's not like that. We think if I do this, God will do this. And we know from the Bible that's just not true. But God chose to bless Abraham. And I think that right there was a very interesting part. God says, I know him. Look at verse 20. The Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now. And this is an interesting part because he does this also with Babel. He did it with Babel. He says he's going to go down. Now, obviously, we know God is omniscient. He knows everything. We know he's omnipresent. He's everywhere. We looked at those traits a number of months ago. But it's kind of interesting when he gives special attention to something. And he says, I'll go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me. And if not, I will know. And the men turned their faces from thence and went towards Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. So these 3 visitors, the Lord stays with Abraham. The 2 others go over to Sodom. And we see them show back up in chapter 19, verse 1, where it says there came 2 angels to Sodom. And we obviously know that story we may get to later. But verse 23, Abraham drew near and said, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there is 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? These verses are very interesting about Abraham because Abraham is almost preaching to God. In fact, he kind of admits it here in just a second. Look how he said. Look what he says to God. Verse 25, that be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked, that be far from thee. You are beyond this. Now look at the rest of that verse. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? I mean, he is preaching to God. And how we know this is verse 27, Abraham answered and said, behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. He admits what he is, but he is trying to get something from God. And you know the rest of this chapter. It's almost a bartering thing in a way. It's him talking God, because it's interesting that Abraham here, this is another thing that's interesting about Abraham, is he is going on behalf of Lot to God. Lot has not been an easy nephew. Lot hasn't been an easy nephew, but I think Abraham has proved over and over that he loved Lot. Because the 2 times where Lot was a major problem, the 3 times he was a problem, Abraham stepped up every time. The first time Lot was a problem was in chapter 13, where their herdmen were fighting, and Lot couldn't keep his herdmen under control. And what does Abraham do? Instead of getting mad, Abraham says, hey, we're going to have to split. I'm going to let you pick the land first. And what does Lot pick? He picks the well-watered land. The next chapter, the very next chapter, chapter 14, Lot gets kidnapped with all of his stuff, and Abraham takes 318 of his men. If I had a map up here, I can show you a very long way to go rescue Lot. So Lot has been a problem, and now God wants to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham is going on his behalf and going before him and saying, listen, don't do this. There's righteous people there. Because he probably hasn't seen Lot at this point for about 20 years. And what's interesting is I think Abraham is giving Lot credit for something that Abraham eventually talks himself out of. In other words, I think he thinks Lot went there with his family, and they were, I understand Old Testament salvation's different, but you'll understand what I'm saying here. He thinks Lot went there and started turning it into a good place, started winning people to the Lord. He's like, no, you can't destroy Sodom. There's good people there. Lot's there. Surely he and his wife and their children, surely they started a church and they led people to the Lord. There's got to be at least 50 people there. And then he starts to remember Lot. Lord, can we make it 45? And he keeps going down, and he keeps going down, and he keeps going down. Then you get to verse 32. Oh, let not the Lord be angry. I will speak yet, but this once, meaning one last time. Peradventure 10 shall be found there, and he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way, and as soon as he had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place. And what's interesting, and preachers do this a lot with this passage, and I think rightfully so. They use that passage to show that God judges a nation based on the presence of God's people, not the condition of the world. And it's super interesting because there's actually a verse in 2 Chronicles, I think it's 7:14, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. He didn't say anything about the condition of the world, because why? Because God has a right now to wipe the entire world out, because there's wickedness in every corner. I don't care how nice a place is, there is wickedness in absolutely every single corner of this earth. God, I told you, we're doing the baby bottle drive right now for Stanton. And I've mentioned it in this class, I mentioned it over the pulpit, because it took me by surprise. But after Roe v. Wade was overturned, abortions went up in this country. Over 100,000 abortions per month. There is enough innocent blood in the ground of this nation for God to wipe it off the planet 10 times over. You say, why doesn't he do it? Because I think there's enough righteous where God looks at it and goes, I'm going to hold off. I have every right to do it. There's all kinds of sins that this country is responsible for, and we have innocent blood all over the hands. And yes, it's us. I'm sorry to say that. If you read Ezra's prayer, Ezra didn't participate in any of the sins, but when he prays to God, he keeps saying, we and our sin. I am part of this country, therefore it is unfortunately our national sin that all those babies have been innocently killed. God has every right to do it, but I think there's a number. I think God has a number. You say, what's that number? I don't know, but I would like to. I think the best thing you can do for this country, outside of dying for it, is to be a righteous person, because that literally will stay the hand of God's judgment on this country. And I think this is a wonderful example of it. We have a few minutes left, and unfortunately, the few minutes we have left, I have a massive story that goes with Genesis 22. And I don't know if I have time to tell it. Let's see. Okay, let's go. Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22. I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell you the story. And we'll come back and cover some of this next time. But Genesis 22 is God finally, remember, Abraham was complaining that he didn't have an heir. He finally gets his heir in Isaac. He knows all the promises. God has made him all these promises. He says you're going to have, all this stuff is going to be, remember chapter 17, Isaac. And then you get to chapter 22 and God tells Abraham, go kill Isaac. Abraham, I completely believed that he would have to kill his son and that God would raise him from the dead. That's what I think, because he did believe him. Because you get to verse, the famous one, verse 7. Chapter 22, verse 7, Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, my father. He said, here am I, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb. And that's where the other Bibles mess it up. They say that he will provide for himself a lamb. No, he will provide himself a lamb. That is a prophecy about Jesus Christ for a burnt offering, so they went both of them together. Now, you and I know the story. God literally spoke from heaven and didn't allow him to actually finish the task of actually killing his son. He just did it as a test to see if he would do it. And that leads me to one story I have, and we'll end with the story, but it will take a few minutes, is a number of years ago, oh my goodness, 2010-ish, 2009, 2010, I was in an adjunct class. I was finishing Bible Institute, and I felt that God was calling me to be a missionary. God had worked on my life about that before, but I'd kind of just ignored it. And it was interesting because I felt God calling me to be a missionary, and I surrendered that night to go be a missionary. And it was interesting because I thought to myself, oh, I'll just take some time, and God will show me eventually where he wants me to go. And then the next morning I was talking to God, and I felt him lay on my heart that he wanted me to go to England. And it's kind of, England, why would I go to England? Okay. And I told God this. So, I thought, okay, well, we'll see what happens with that. I said to God, God, I've never even talked to a person from England. I said, you bring somebody from England by me, and I'll know that this is what you want me to do. That day at work, in walks a man who comes and sits across from my dad's desk, and he talks to him for 2 hours about England. And so it's kind of interesting where all these things started to line up, and I thought to myself, wow. And so I told my wife, and this was a big, long 5-year process, to be honest with you. We were already in talks with our mission board. We were already scheduled to be part of a missions conference here. That was going to be the start of it. And it was interesting because, like I said, this lasted like 5 years. We had sold our house. We had sold almost everything we've possibly physically had. We were beginning to start to book meetings and all these things, and having we had gone on a survey trip. We had gone for a week to England, and we spent a week in Ireland where I preached for a missionary there. And I was in a lot of talks with Brother Pete Dickens over there. We were talking monthly about where I could possibly go when I got over there. And we were getting ready to buy an RV. We had all these things. We had all these things lined up, and we were ready to go. And then it was interesting because I started having health issues. And I'm going to be honest with you. I started having some mental battles that I had never had before. But I really started having some major health issues, especially with my esophagus. And in fact, when we got back from our survey trip, the very next day I had to go into the hospital where they went and stretched my esophagus back out. And it was weird because there were all these things that lined up to where it just made it real obvious that God wasn't going to let us go. And I'm like, Lord, I have surrendered to do this. We have sold everything we have. Everyone knows we're going. We've got everything lined up. We are ready to go. And we were so excited, and we had all these dreams, and we had these visions of things that we would do on deputation and all these things. And it was interesting because God made it very clear that he was never going to let me go. And I fell into quite a depression state after then. I remember having a meeting with Preacher, 2 meetings with Preacher. I remember telling him, I said, man, I just don't know what to do with myself. I feel like a failure. And I said, I don't know what's going on here because I thought God's never wrong, so clearly I'm wrong. And it took me a number of years to kind of get a hold and talk to some people about this, but it was very interesting because today I'm here to tell you, you say, well, so God didn't really call you. Oh, no, he called me. He had no intention of letting me go. You say, God would do that? Oh, yeah. I remember talking to Preacher about it one time, and I looked at him, I said, Preacher, didn't you say that you thought you were called to be a missionary? And Preacher looks at me and goes like this, twice. As a pastor of this church, there were 2 different times where he thought he was called to leave it as a missionary. And it was interesting because God, I know it's weird, but we talked a little bit about that today, where there are some aspects of God that we don't always understand. We don't always understand why he blesses, who he blesses, or how he blesses. And we don't always understand when he puts, like I said, this was a 5-year thing. This wasn't some overnight deal where my wife and I were ready to leave. We had a daughter when we were on our survey trip, and then we had our son, and we were completely ready to go. And we were more than willing, and then all of a sudden it just feels like it got ripped out. And some of you, I know some of you are in here, some of you might remember that story. We were getting ready to go. But there might be some things in life where God puts you through something, and he might even tell you to do it and call you to do it, and he has no intention of letting you do it. He just wants to see if you're willing, because then he can say he knows you. I'm no Abraham. Believe me, I'm no Abraham. But then he can say, I know him. Yeah, I can trust him. He'll do what I say. And that's the basis, that's the bottom, that's the basic line of getting God to bless you. And I said, like I said, there is no magic formula. There never will be, because we can see that with Job. But this Bible is so full of all these amazing stories like this where you go, man, can you believe that? My son's in here today. I never in 1,000 years could offer my son on an altar. I couldn't do that. But God had no intention of letting him do it. And that's just one of my, I know this is more of a fact-based class, but that's one of my devotional ones for you this morning. Sometimes God puts us through things, and it's amazing. He'll just do it just to try us and just to test us. Well, that seems weird. Well, he just wants to know how much you love him. And so let's bow for a word of prayer, and we'll be on to the next service. Father, we thank you this morning for your word. Lord, you are so good to us. We don't always understand your ways, and the Bible even says that. Your ways aren't our ways. But as your basic foolish children, Lord, will you please bless us even though we don't deserve it? Might you preserve this country for your glory and nothing else. Might it be a bastion of sending out missionaries and supporting churches and supporting things like Stanton. Lord, I just pray that that's what we would be, that we would be who we're supposed to be, so that you would withhold your wrath on this country so that it continues to be, like I said, a bastion for your glory. I know we have a lot of problems, but Lord, there are a lot of righteous people right now having services all across this country that love you, Lord, and I pray that we would continue to do so, for you are worthy, and if you don't get glory, Lord, there's no purpose to anything. So I pray that you would get glory. We love you so dearly. We pray that you might be with us this morning in this next service. Guide and direct us. We love you so dearly, and we pray and ask these things in your son's name. Amen. All right, you're dismissed. Thank you.